Welcome to B2B Marketers on a Mission, a podcast for change makers where we question the conventional, debunk marketing myths, provide actionable tips, think differently, disrupt industries, and take your marketing to a new level. From improving your campaigns to making you a better marketer, these are the inspirational stories that will help us change the way we think and approach B2B marketing one conversation at a time. This podcast is brought to you by Untitled Consulting, helping you to stand out in the market and drive revenue to your B2B business. And now your host, Christian Klepp. Okay, welcome everyone to this episode of B2B Marketers on a Mission. This is the show where we help you to question the conventional, think differently, disrupt your industry, and take your marketing to new heights. This is your host, Christian Klepp, and today I'm joined by someone on a mission to help B2B companies to create case studies and video testimonials that hopefully shorten the sales cycle. So coming to us from St. Petersburg, Florida, Julian Lumpkin, welcome to the show.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me, Christian.
Hey, listen, I mentioned this just before we hit record, but I'm giving myself a little bit of pressure for this interview. It's a pleasure to have you on. And the reason why I'm giving myself pressure is because we've had quite a number of folks come on to talk about case studies and video testimonials. So it is my hope with this conversation that we offer a slightly different perspective and inject some new flavors into what people are going to say is, oh, that topic again, right?
It's great that it's become such a topic that multiple people are coming on podcasts and talking about it. And I come from a pretty different angle, as you'll hear. So excited to get into it. And I'm sure you'll have some really nuanced questions that I'm excited to get into.
Fantastic. All right. Well, let's get the show on the road then. Okay. So you're an expert when it comes to case studies and video testimonials for B2B industries. And so for this conversation, let's focus on the topic of how to accelerate sales at the different stages of the sales process or the sales cycle. So I'd like to kick off this conversation with this question. What do you think is slowing B2B sales down? So talk to us specifically about where you feel sales is falling short.
Yeah, I think that, anyone who's been in sales like myself knows that, on the day-to-day grind, the biggest challenge of a sales process is to get the person you're speaking with to trust what you're saying. If you've got a credible solution and you've done good prospecting and good targeting, and you're speaking to someone you actually can deliver results for, the main thing that is stopping them from moving forward is believing your claims. And I want to emphasize the when used correctly, because that is what it's all about. Proper customer proof in the form of case studies and video testimonials can close that trust gap.
Absolutely. And I'd like to add in another question there. Where do you feel B2B companies are using this incorrectly? Like, what have you seen out there in terms of the mistakes that companies make when it comes to case studies and video testimonials? What do they get wrong, number one? And number two, how should they fix it?
Yeah, there's so many ways I can answer this question, so many different angles we could come at it from. But I want to give you the simplest answers, one from a company perspective and one from a more individual kind of sales tactical perspective. From a company level, at B2B companies, and you may be surprised to hear this, and maybe this is true for some of your audience, maybe not true for others, but the biggest mistake we see is the simplest one, which is not just getting a proper amount of case studies done and then making them available to the sales team. Now, this may sound really simple and obvious, but you would be shocked by how many companies, credible, good B2B companies, do below what I would call the minimum of having a solid repository of case studies that is available to the sales team. So if you are a marketer at a company or just work for a company, before you go into all the details of what makes a perfect case study, and if you start to work with an agency, they're going to really want to focus on all of the details of what makes a perfect case study. And we can talk about that all day and different things we do. But the first thing that you should ask yourself is, do we have enough and what's a minimum threshold of what the right number of case studies for our company sales and marketing team are? And that can be very different company to company. There's different factors. But the biggest mistake I see companies make is focusing on trying to get a couple perfect case studies and missing the minimum threshold of an acceptable amount of case studies. That's the biggest problem I see companies making. The biggest mistake I see individual sellers making is not truly knowing and understanding the case studies. So when you give your case studies to a sales team, or if you're a sales team receiving case studies, the way to make them effective is not just to have them and think that, oh, if I attach this PDF to an email, my prospect is going to trust me. The key for the sales reps, and if you're in marketing or sales enablement, you need to enable and facilitate this, is making sure the sales reps truly know, internalize, and understand the case studies so that they can bring them up authentically when they're truly relevant to the person that they're speaking with. And these might sound like some simple answers, but these two things are very often missed, and if done correctly, can be a complete game changer for any sales and marketing team.
Oh, those are some really good points. And I mean, going back to what you said, I have actually seen those scenarios play out. Like, for example, working with companies in the past that A, didn't have enough case studies, or B, they didn't have case studies that were relevant to the companies that they were prospecting. So they would use this one size fits all approach. And then they have this vertical where they're showing this case study to, and it doesn't resonate with those prospects because they're like, okay, well, that's fantastic and good for you, but what does that have to do with me, right? I mean, they don't exactly say it that way, but it's generally that response, right?
Yeah, and I see this from kind of the way that this happens, and maybe at the risk of calling out some of your audience if this is them, but it is very often the same people that are so focused on the details of how to write a perfect case study that ultimately don't create any significant volume of case studies. So it's really interesting what I see, and I can't tell you how frequently I see this, where I'll meet with a company, they acknowledge they need case studies, and they're kind of deciding between doing it internally and working with us. And as they go through this evaluation, they're so focused on what are the elements that make a perfect case study, and finding that perfect client, perfect situation, perfect story to tell, and thinking that a few great case studies are going to really move the needle. And those are the same companies that I talk to 1-2 years later that still don't have any case studies, or still only have 2 or 3 case studies. So I think that there's a little bit of a shift in mindset that needs to occur if this applies to you as a marketer, which is to recognize that case studies can never be perfect. They're client stories. Your clients are great. They have great answers, but none of them are perfect. No one client story is going to satisfy all of your prospect questions. So what I have seen in my time doing this for 7 years is the biggest mistake marketers make is failing to take action.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And on that note, I had a follow-up question for you, Julian. Like, this would probably be relevant to many members of the audience who are in this situation. As I mentioned earlier, companies that try to enter new verticals, and they're trying to have these conversations with prospects. But let's say, for instance, they don't have that social proof, they don't have that case study that really hits the nail on the head for this particular vertical. If you were in that situation, how would you handle that?
I've been in that situation. In fact, I was in that situation as a sales rep many times. And that's what ultimately led me to start the company, because I could see the difference of how incredibly different it was selling when I had direct case studies for a particular product, audience, or vertical versus not. So I felt that firsthand, and I did see it. And essentially what you have to do as a sales rep is, be direct about it. And, they're really, you can't fake a case study. You can't talk around. You can't convince people someone is like them if they're not. So you have to show them that, you have credibility in other industries. What I would also look to do in that situation, industry, I think the example you mentioned is a company, you don't have any case studies in the same industry as them. Well, industry is only one factor. So I would look for other things to match that person up with a case study. Ideally, obviously, you're doing this within their industry as well. But I would think about things like, okay, well, what department are they from? Because for example, a VP of operations may resonate with a VP of operations from a completely different industry to them, better than they would a VP of finance in their industry. So look for other things like the persona, the biggest problem that they have, like what they're really focused on, what their challenges are. Anything else that you can match them up, I would look for. But depending on how many other case studies you have, the answer is you have to be direct with them, explain the situation, and build out that case study for that industry as quickly as you can.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I mean, it's also one of these scenarios where, and you know where I'm going with this. Like, for instance, if you're trying to like enter the semiconductors vertical and you don't have those relevant case studies, how can you show something from a different vertical that might still be at least to a certain degree relevant, right?
Yeah.
That shows that you have that competency, and if you don't have that competency, you have that capability to wrap your head quickly around their ecosystem, because that's what they want to know too, right? They want to know, okay, are you able to understand how our industry works, what the challenges are, right? What the process or the cycle of everything that we have to go through looks like.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And at the risk of being repetitive, I think this just brings up the first point I brought up. So, this really puts it all into focus, because what we see happening, and I guarantee you there are people in your audience right now in the situation that were in that situation, acquired the clients in that vertical, but their sales team still doesn't have case studies because they are looking for a perfect case study, waiting for something else to happen and not doing it. So when you think about that difference, and I use this in my own sales process of, if the person is experienced, they're like, think about what it's like to sell into a new industry where you don't have case studies. If you don't create case studies, you're essentially sending your sales reps into that situation unnecessarily. So I think your question is important, how to do it, to use other case studies in that situation, but also just really highlights how much of a mistake a marketer is making if they allow their company to put off or find excuses to getting, case studies done for their different verticals.
Absolutely. It reminds me of, well, the story that you keep hearing in tech and SaaS, right? Like, if you keep waiting for the perfect product to be launched, the perfect plan, the perfect roadmap, then you're waiting too long. Then you're already too late.
I think this applies to so many different, there's so many examples of this. The example of it I give, and there's a little more out there, but like, picture two people, it's kind of like two people trying to get in shape. One sits and evaluates, looks for the perfect gym, the perfect program, the perfect diet, the perfect this, and this. And maybe you can find little things that are better, but what's way more effective is just starting and actually taking action and joining that gym, starting that case study and building and learning on it and talking to your clients and learn what they say and use what you get, organically to create that case study, build other content, and prepare for the next one.
Exactly. All right, I'm going to move us on to the next question, where I'd like you to talk to us about the importance of having a deep understanding of the customers or the prospects, as well as their buyer's journey. And how can this help to build more trust?
Yeah, I think, this helps from both sides, first I'll talk about it from the case study creation perspective. So when you're creating a case study, you really want to have a firm understanding of your sales and marketing process, because when you're interviewing that client to write the case study, you do want to let them, to an extent, not, you want to steer the conversation, but you want to let their perspective shine through, but you do want to steer the conversation. So when possible, by knowing the most important gaps or difficulties, challenges, objections that you face in your sales process, what you can do is get your current clients to talk through those issues. So let's think about like a really simple example. Let's say you help companies implement their CRM, for example. And you know that one of the big sticking points in your sales process is, dealing with the 1 month that you're going to be switching from, Salesforce to HubSpot or whatever it is. And, that one of the main reasons people say no to you is, that period where we're switching is just going to be too rough. What you can do then, by knowing that as a marketer and talking to your sales team and understanding like what are the things that they hear, and this is an oversimplified example, but then when you're doing a case study and you're interviewing that client to get them to say, what were you most concerned about before working with us? And looking for them to say, oh, well, I was actually really concerned about the transition period. And then by knowing what your prospects are concerned about, you can get your current clients to go back to when they were in that same situation and say, well, I was worried about that 1 month transition, but the way that they set up the data transfer and how the data goes over, we did this week, this week, such that it never really interrupted things beyond XYZ. If you don't know your buyer's journey and the different sticking points in your marketing cycle, you could quickly brush over that and say, oh, okay, great, but we did it fast. Yes, great. But by knowing that that's something your prospects are concerned about when you hear that from a client. So it's all about connecting where your prospect is here. They have these concerns. Your client is here, but they used to have those concerns. And connecting those two with questions are what great case studies do. They get the client to put themselves back in the shoes of a prospect. And that's why our case studies always focus so much more on problems than results, because it's getting the client to go back to when they were a prospect, to put themselves in that mindset, because that's where your prospects are. Talk about those same things that they were concerned about, and then why ultimately it worked because or in spite of those issues.
That's an interesting perspective. So I'm going to play the devil's advocate here, because going back to something that you said earlier, right?
Yeah.
I'm not saying that I entirely disagree with you, but going back to what you said about focusing on the problems instead of the results.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't you focus that much on the results? I mean, that seems to be everybody's go-to when it comes to case study, right? That's what they want to see. Okay, what are the results? What are the results? And they want to see especially the quantifiable aspect of it. And my all-time favorite word, what was the ROI? Right?
Yeah. I don't mean to say that you shouldn't collect the results when you can get them. Don't get me wrong. But okay, just think about it from your own perspective.
Sure.
When you see an email that says someone can save you 10% on your costs or increase your revenue 15%, are you excited? Are you like, oh my God, I need to learn about how this person can do that? Or do you get 20 emails saying save 10%, save 20%, see this, see that? Do you see that stuff all the time?
Yeah, it's more you treat those more with suspicion than anything.
And I think a better way to think about it is the results aren't impressive until they're in context. Everyone has, every company has clients that have achieved results, or they wouldn't be around anymore. When you hear a company say they achieved a result, it's not just immediately interesting, because for a few reasons, we're bombarded with people saying they can save us money, whether it's in our business emails, on television, for our insurance. It's just save 20% or increase revenue 15% is everywhere. And it just doesn't have any sort of connection to yourself as a prospect. On the other hand, if there's something specific you are struggling with, That's top of mind. Your prospects don't wake up saying, how can I find some solution that will save me 15%? They wake up thinking, oh, this thing in my CRM isn't working right. This drives me crazy. There's got to be a better way to do this. We lose 2 days on our this, every time this happens. So the results are important, but they're only important after the person reading it can connect with the situation. So we always try to get results in our case studies, but we focus way more on the problems. What were you struggling with before you were working with this vendor? And then the results are really there to back up the fact that it helped, rather than most of the time be the lead in the story. There are exceptions. Don't get me wrong. There are certain situations where it's like, you achieve this result, the people reading it will understand the significance of it, and you want to lead with that. But more often we're leading with this company had a problem and they were able to solve it.
Good answer. I'm going to move us on to another question. And rather than asking you something that you brought up a few minutes ago about like, okay, tell us, Julian, what the perfect case study looks like. Instead of asking you that, I would rather ask you something I've asked the other guests on the show. How do you save the B2B world from boring case studies?
Yeah, it's really difficult. And, I think that if you're creating case studies thinking you're going to create some viral piece of content, you've just got the wrong idea for them. So I think that you want to make your case studies as interesting as possible. Don't get me wrong. But to start with, how could I make this so interesting that everyone's going to click and share it, really misses the purpose of a case study. They're never, it's not edutainment. It's not, you're not producing this, amazing 2-minute video that you work on all year and then, everyone sees and shares. So I think that you want to avoid them being boring by not making them too long. So we typically do 2 to 3 pages, not focusing on technical detail too much. And the way to achieve, that is by letting your client's voice and perspective shine through. So letting them explain what's important to them rather than make sure you talk about all their terms, more than your own tool rather. So like let them talk about the challenges they solve. But ultimately, case studies are only interesting when they're in the right context. They're not entertainment. And I think this is why in some cases, case studies get a bad rap, because people use them incorrectly, or they think, oh, I shared this case study. I posted a PDF of a case study on LinkedIn and, only 8 people liked it. Well, yeah, because they're not interesting in that content, except in very certain situations if you have a big home run new client. But most of the time, case studies are interesting because they're put in the right context, because the person, they're interesting to the person that they're supposed to speak to at that moment. So when you do case studies, they're very different from the rest of marketing content. The goal is not to make them as exciting and get the most immediate eyeballs on them. They're for a very specific audience and a specific time. And you want to avoid boring, but we haven't seen companies go the direction of, turning them into little comedy sketches. And I don't see it going that way.
That's a really good point. And I suppose you're not creating these case studies in the hope that Netflix is going to call you, right? That's exactly. Also, like you said, it's kind of like missing the point, right? But yeah. I do have one follow-up question for you, like based on what you just said. Is there a particular format that you guys advocate, or does it depend on the vertical? Does it depend on the stage of the buyer's journey, or what are the factors involved?
Yeah, all of the factors. There's no one, there's no perfect format. There's no perfect length. There's no perfect structure. And, it drives me crazy when people debate what's better, video or written. I think that's really, honestly, it's just like self-serving. People who produce videos will tell you video is better. People who produce written content will tell you written content is better. And, to try to decide between them or figure out the right format, I think is really the wrong approach. I think that the way that I kind of get my clients to think about these things is just to remember that each person consuming your content is going to have different preferences. Some of them like to watch video. Some of them like to read. Some of them like to watch short video. Some of them like long form content. And that's why the kind of idea of like, every people are different. There's no one perfect format to make your case study that's going to engage everyone. So really the answer to that question is to have a lot of different formats so that you can tailor it, or the person consuming it can tailor what they consume based on how they like to consume content. So when we do a case study of our clients, we might make a one slide deck. We might make a 2-minute video, a few 20-second videos, a 3-page version, a 1-page version. Because again, depending on who the person reading it is, where they are in the sales cycle, what industry they're in, the technical details of the solution, all of those factors are going to determine what the best format is.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I tend to agree with that. I mean, one, it really depends. Secondly, it's also dependent on, to your point, how your prospects consume content, right?
Yeah, and as an example, I'm curious, do you have a favorite way of consuming case studies or content in general?
I'm a little bit biased because I'm a writer, so written content. That being said, I do like watching videos too.
Nice.
Right.
Yeah.
But I will say that even though I do enjoy written content, I do think it's important to give the content some breathing space and insert infographics or I'm a big fan of infographics and diagrams and charts, right? Because it not only helps to break up those huge chunks of text, but it also helps you to provide some visual context rather.
Yep.
Right. To highlight what is being outlined in this case study. Like for instance, and I think this is relevant not just in B2B tech, but just across the board, where they have comparison charts, right? Like what happened, what was the situation like before, and when they started using the solution or the software or the technology, what happened afterwards, and if that is quantifiable, then fantastic. Another one is also like just to show like diagrams or like the process, the different processes or the different journeys that these companies went on, like from where they were before to where they are right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that makes perfect sense. And one thing we'll try to do in a lot of our case studies is, if you're going to do a 3, maybe a 4-page case study, you want it to be such that the prospect can just read it straight through, but that they can also scan it and get the idea. And things like bigger language, call out boxes, diagrams, make it so you can have a meaty 3-4-page document, but that is also totally scannable.
And another follow-up question for you, Julian, because you're so good at answering these questions, I'm just going to throw one more in there. The audience, I know for sure, is struggling with this scenario.
Great.
It's important to get, like you said, it's important to get as many case studies produced as possible. But I've heard it more than once, right, where people say, yeah, we really would like to do that, but sometimes we have a hard time getting the customer to agree to a case study. Or so what I mean is like to say yes, you can do a case study about this particular scenario or about our specific case. So long story short, how do you get the customer to agree to a case study or to a video testimonial?
Yeah, this is a great question. So we definitely don't have any magic bullet to make your customers agree to be in a case study. And when a client brings up the situation you just brought to me, we're going to have a conversation to basically try to understand which is the case. On the one hand, you might be saying that because your clients truly will not go on record and talk about you the vast majority of the time. Some of the examples of places we see that are companies that serve the government, certain or most types of cybersecurity companies, financial technology software. There are when I hear that question, the first thing I'm trying to determine is it truly a company-wide situation that your clients don't want to go on record, don't want to put their name and logo and participate in case studies? If that's the case, then we're going to talk about ways to do anonymous or semi-anonymous case studies. We can talk about that if you'd like. It's a separate conversation. Unless you really have to, I don't recommend going down that road. The other side, and I'm suspecting this is more what you meant, is that you're just having a hard time getting your clients to say yes. So there's a few things that I would make sure to have in place in that situation. So number one is making sure it's very clear to the client that they are going to have final sign off on the content from the very beginning. So, it's kind of make sure they know we're paying for this, we're going to do all the work. But you, the case study subject, will get to review and approve the content before it's finalized. So saying that in the beginning, making sure that they know that you're going to make them and their brand look good. So I talked about problem-based case studies, which are great. If you have clients that are very difficult to get involved in case studies, they may not want to go on record talking about a problem they had. So you might have to shift the approach you take of the case study. You always want to make them the hero. So it's never like, oh, they were clueless, they didn't know what they're doing, and then they found us and now they're great. You can make it clear to them that you're going to position them as taking extra steps to get out in front and at the forefront of their industry, and basically them as being the leaders. So make sure that they know that they're going to get that they're going to be the hero of the story. And then finally, just to make sure they know you have like a really tight process for getting it done. Many people have been involved in a case study where it's someone from marketing interviews you, then someone from the other team interviews you, and it takes 3 hours. So lay out the steps for it. So laying out those three things: timing, how long it's going to take them, that they get final sign off, and then you're going to make them look good. So making sure those things are in place. And then it's really about making sure the requests actually get made. So I tell my clients in certain industries, if you want to get a case study done, you might have to ask 5 or 10 clients before getting a yes. And that's okay. I think that, so sometimes it's really just about upping the volume. Some will say maybe, and you'll have to follow up with them. We obviously we handle this for our clients, but like, you've got to make the requests. And those are the main things that'll do it. The last thing I'll say, and this is really about just kind of more generally running a good company, but I will note that in my experience, one of the main factors in whether a company ultimately agrees to do a case study is the person's direct relationship with their account manager. In certain situations, it's very easy for a company to participate in a case study, and then it doesn't really matter. They like your solution enough, they'll do it. But usually that person has to, or very often that person has to go to bat internally. And it often becomes a very they're doing it, not, you could have two companies that both love your product. And if one of them doesn't have a great relationship with their account manager, they're just going to say, no, why bother? You could have someone who likes your product and they have a great relationship with their account manager. When the account manager asks them, they feel kind of personally obligated and want to help. So if there's kind of a tip in there, it's making, I recommend the request not come from your marketing department, but from the account manager that has the relationship. And then just more generally, facilitating your account managers building great relationships with your clients, I think is good advice for everyone.
Yeah, no, those are some really great points. And thanks again for sharing those. I would also throw in, and I'm sure this is where you were going with that too, that companies shouldn't just be asking for case studies just before they need them, right? This has to be like something that it's like you said, it's nurturing those relationships with the customers on an ongoing basis, so that when the time comes that you actually do need to write the case studies or the video testimonials, that they're all warmed up already, right? And it's also planned ahead of time. It shouldn't be like this knee-jerk reaction where somebody says, okay, because I've seen this happen, right? Oh, we've got a big pitch, we've got to submit the proposal by, in a couple of weeks, and we need case studies, like we need 4 or 5 case studies pronto. So everybody's in reactive mode. And by then it's already too late.
Completely agree. And I think I'm answering very much, thinking that your audience is kind of in the and the people really listening are in like the getting it going phase,
Yeah.
and that's what's important. But
Yes.
yeah, the next step is what you brought up, and you said it really well. And the only thing I'll add to it is, when this all comes together and is done correctly, you're selling with case studies during your sales process. So you're already setting them up to understand, like, okay, this company does case studies, they're seeing them. And then when you make the request, you can say, like, hey, remember, you were really concerned about our ability to, do the data transfer in the span of 2 weeks, within our CRM. And we showed you that case study. Well, now we've achieved some results for you. Do you think we can document how, exactly your story so that we can help someone else? So it all starts to come together of having a process for getting case studies into your sales process, bringing it up with clients, casually during the sales process, and then as you're achieving results for them, and it kind of turns into a bit of a flywheel effect, to use the popular term of the day.
Absolutely. All right, Julian, we get to the point in the show where we're talking about actionable tips, right? So let's appreciate that the kind of work that you and your company do, these aren't things that you can do in 24 hours. There isn't, like, at least not to my knowledge, there isn't an app that you can download and then bam, right? Instant results. But going back to your point about the people that listen to the show who are probably in this situation, what is, like, a piece of advice, or maybe 3 to 5 things that you could tell them to do right now to develop those case studies that will help to shorten the sales cycle?
Yeah. So if I were a marketer in that situation, what is the approximate minimum number of case studies we need to be in a solid situation? And by that, I mean both a number of case studies, and if you sell to kind of 4 very distinct verticals or different personas, to maybe have one case study that hits each of these. So if I were in that situation, the first thing I would do, I would try to make this very specific and numerical. How many do we need? What are the goals? And I think it's such an important step, because the mistake I see marketers make is, like you said, they wait until they need them. They wait until they see or for a perfect situation. But by agreeing with sales leadership, people who are going to use these case studies, obviously you can as a marketer too, and saying, what is that minimum position that we need to be in? Writing that down, agreeing with sales and or account management that we're going to, ask the right number of people to get that. I would decide on the number that you need. Try to get a sense of what percentage of your clients are going to be willing to participate, and you'll know that pretty quickly. And then build a plan that is committed to and agreed with your marketing team and your account management team. One of the main things we see stopping companies from getting case studies done is just there's too much interdepartment coordination that doesn't happen. So you want to get all 3 departments on the same page. This is what we need from marketing, from sales, and from account management, and then start getting them done.
Fantastic. One more follow-up question for the day, I promise. All right.
I've got time. Go on.
No, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, because there's a lot of, the guests who have come on previously, and also people on LinkedIn have been talking about this, but the format for the case study. And I know that there's several camps out there, and one camp says you should stop, listing it as the problem, the solution, and the results. And then other people are saying, like, no, that is the format that you should be using. And others are saying, like, no, there's a better format now. So over to you. What's the correct format that folks should be using to create case studies?
Yes. I wouldn't choose a specific format. It's something I talk with each of my clients about. What I can say is that anyone telling you problem, solution, result doesn't work because there's some new fancy or entertainment way, and that's like the old boring case study. I think is overcomplicating their case studies. You can have different structures, leading with the big, kind of most exciting part or problem, and different structures and custom headlines that kind of tie back to problem, situation, result, because that is a good focus. But I think over focusing on something like this really misses the point. The important part is that it's your customer's authentic story, that it speaks to the right audience, that it's used correctly. Whether you make your header's problem or describe the actual problem in that header, I don't think is that important.
Totally agree. All right.
And just to add to that,
yes.
So this is something we ask our clients about. About 50% of the case studies we do follow that very closely. 50% take slight variations.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, it's back to what we've been talking about all this time. It really depends on the situation, right?
Exactly. Yeah. If there's one take I'd give is that's what makes case studies. When you hear people saying case studies don't work, or they're not that good, or they're this or that, it's about how they use them. They're not a magic bullet. They need to be presented in the right situation with context. That's what makes a case study powerful.
Absolutely. Julian, I have this feeling that you've been on your soapbox all this time, but I'd like to ask you to stay on there a little bit longer for this next question. So, what is a status quo in your area of expertise that you passionately disagree with, and why?
The biggest thing is that case studies need direct numerical results to be powerful. And it's kind of like if they have, and this idea that if a case study has a specific percentage in it, it's a good case study. And if a case study doesn't have that, it's a bad case study, or it's less effective. And that seems to be what most people think before they really dive into case studies. And I disagree.
I tend to disagree with that as well. Right. I mean, I've heard it so many times before that, when you present case studies and they don't see the quantifiable results, that's why I asked the question about, the whole ROI question. Because how often have you heard customers or prospects say, well, if you can't quantify the results, then that's not a good case study, or that's not a good result. And I tend to disagree with that. Because it really depends.
And I ask people to think of it's such a kind of us marketing focused point of view. Think of, I always, when I have these conversations, I try to get people to put yourself back in the prospect situation.
Yeah.
Can you write out an ROI for every piece of software that you use and like? No, that doesn't mean you don't like them. So if a company's forcing you into that mindset, they're not going with how prospects naturally think about things. And it may seem like numerical is always better and it's great to have them, but in reality, just because something's good doesn't mean you can define it numerically, and not having that. And it depends on the situation.
Absolutely. Julian, this has been a great conversation. You handled all my impromptu questions like a champ. So thank you so much for your time and for sharing your expertise and experience with the listeners. So please, quick intro and how folks out there can get in touch with you.
Well, first of all, thanks for asking such good detailed questions. I do a lot of these interviews, and your questions really got to the heart of what matters in case studies. If people want to find me or SuccessKit, they can find me on LinkedIn, Julian Lumpkin. I'm the only one with that name, so pretty easy to find. If you're interested in our company or help with case studies, it's SuccessKit, the word success, KIT.io.
Fantastic. So once again, Julian, thanks so much for your time. Take care, stay safe, and talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Bye for now.